welcome to September's IoT North. I'm really glad to have everybody on board. We've got two fantastic talks, one from Matt Hatton from Transformer Insights. He's going to be giving us some insight on where those 50 billion connections were supposed to be and where they are. And if we'll get there, hopefully you'll be able to give us some insight on that, Matt. And we also have Adrian Firth. Adrian is not speaking on behalf of Telefonica, although he does work for them. And he is going to be giving us some insight in the sunsetting of 2G and 3G. So that'll be really interesting, especially considering some of the talks that we've had recently about mobile connectivity. So Matt, great to have you on board. Thanks very much for agreeing to join us.
My pleasure, Paul. Nice to be here.
So, I mean, I follow you avidly on Twitter and LinkedIn and read your blogs and podcasts, which you've just started doing, which are great.
Hi.
Really enjoying those. So, first of all, I'd just like to get an understanding of how did you become an analyst and a researcher? What sort of drove you down that path?
Sheer blind luck. Is that an acceptable answer?
It's how I got where I got.
There you go. I saw a job ad about coming up on 25 years ago for somebody to come and work for a telecoms research company called CIT. You can look for them. They're not there anymore. Not through no fault of my own, I hasten to add. And I thought it sounded quite interesting. It was that or a job as the, hang on a minute, the company secretary for the people who make Badger beer, which actually might have been all right.
Yeah.
It was delivering turkeys to people who they have to deliver a turkey to every year and making sure the company doesn't go bust and that kind of stuff. So, yeah, I figured the telecoms one was for me, and I kind of threw myself into it and ended up wanting to know what I was talking about. So went back to school and did a master's in telecoms at UCL, and I think I'm stuck in this for the duration now. I doubt there's anything I'll ever be able to do again, or I'll be going back to square one with it.
Yeah,
so I'm a lifer now.
Yeah, I mean, I've tried to escape telecom a fair few times, but it seems that telecom touches everything. So you end up getting pulled in. It's, you worked in telecom, you know about this. It's like, yeah, okay. So it can get quite interesting. So when did you first touch on to IoT?
Well, I was a telecoms. I am a telecoms guy. That was what the masters was. That was what I was always doing in my analyst time, mostly on mobile. And around about 2007, 2008, the mobile operators seemed to be quite interested in this machine-to-machine telemetry thing.
Yeah.
So I started covering that a little bit for the firms I was working for at the time. And then come 2011, I thought it was sufficiently interesting and sufficiently likely to expand beyond all belief that I thought, you know what, it might be worth having an analyst firm focused specifically on this. And I'd worked previously with a guy who had an analyst firm focused just on OSS, right? He was my boss. And I thought, if someone can found a firm that's just looking at operational support systems and billing systems and that kind of thing, I reckon there's room for one looking just at IoT or machine to machine as it was then. And so we got started with that with Makina Research. That was the first company, and sold that on to Gartner in November 2016, and then launched Transformational Insights 9 months ago. Yeah.
And how's that gone? I mean, especially, as we all know, there's been COVID impact of positives and negatives for everybody. How's it impacted you guys?
It's difficult to know because we're only 9 months in. Right. And the first time around, it took a good 9 months before we were up to speed, selling very much and getting the levels of interest that we wanted. And so it's difficult to know whether it's just, that's how long it takes, or COVID's having an impact, or it's just because it's the summer, or any of these various variables. It's the worst example of a trial that you could possibly imagine. We've more or less changed all the possible variables, and we're wondering whether the results ought to be what they were before, or whether they should be different. So we're hopeful. The pipeline is looking really strong, and September's promising to be incredibly busy. We've got some really interesting research coming out in September. So we're expecting great things, but it has been odd, shall we say, not being able to go to events. That's probably the biggest one. Conferences for us, no Mobile World Congress and no CeBIT and all of these various other shows we just couldn't do. Sorry, Hanover Messe now.
I mean, I personally was quite glad MWC was cancelled, because I was kind of not looking forward to that 50-mile walk of a week.
Oh, I know.
Um,
Well, it's one of my favourite weeks of the year. I must be a guy.
I've had some great MWC events, and I've had some absolutely awful ones as well. The last one I went to wasn't the best. I thought it was. I kind of felt like it was just like a whole event of misleading around 5G. Nobody really knew, but everybody was doing it, you know. But it was like, so then you ask for a demonstration and so on and so forth, and nobody could give you the real value. And I kind of struggle a little bit still to get the real value.
You didn't believe the discussions around remote surgery, how that was going to change the world, and everybody's going to be doing remote surgery, using remote surgery? No, quite right. The funny thing is, and I said this a few years ago, that 5G talks about IoT a lot, and IoT talks about 5G almost not at all. And I think that's the distinction, right? 5G is a technology almost looking for a justification.
Yeah.
Whereas IoT is, you know, within IoT, we use what technologies are available, and anything that doesn't really actually seem to provide any benefit tends to get jettisoned pretty quickly, and rightly so. Now, that's not to say that there's not some interesting aspects to 5G, particularly the low latency. I think for some of the industrial applications, actually, that's really fascinating. But this is pretty niche stuff, and it's going to take a while before you kind of got that whole ecosystem around it to actually.
That's just it, and you know, like sort of bring together technology value with return of investment, basically cost. The cost to implement that across a factory doesn't really add up at the moment because the other part of the infrastructure isn't there. However, there's other stuff that can enable in industrial to actually benefit low latency by edge computing and adopting that methodology and that software, that you can do that today, and you're not going to have the cost that's being offered, and it's scalable as well. You're going to make an investment in 5G. Guess what? 6G is around the corner. Donald Trump's already talking about it. He's bought it, allegedly.
He's the technology guru. He's the man that we all have to listen to.
He knows everything.
One thing you take away from tonight's session, it's listen to what Donald Trump has to say.
Exactly. Hey, Matt, thanks very much for the intro conversation there. I'd like to hand over to you to get started, buddy.
Absolutely. Let me get sharing my screen. Momentary pause while we work out it's that. There we go, and then we get that one going there. And that should be working.
That's working beautifully.
Excellent. All right. So let me just move that out of the way so I can see what I'm doing. All right. Thanks for the intro, Paul. And I'm here to talk about the Internet of Things myth, which is a book that I wrote back in April this year, or published it April this year. And you'll be pleased to hear that the Internet of Things isn't a myth, but I'll explain the title in a little bit. Now, background to it is that I wrote it with a guy called William Webb. Some of you might know William if you've been around in the IoT for long enough or broad enough. So he was the CTO of Newell, the company whose technology formed the basis of the narrowband IoT technology, which has been available for the last few years. They were acquired by Huawei in 2014, if I remember rightly. He was also the chairman of the IET, worked at Ofcom, and so on. So someone eminently more qualified than me. So I managed to hitch myself to his coattails, and we wrote a book together. So he tended to focus on some of the more technical things around the mobile networks, and I was sharing some of the things that I have learned from being a technology industry analyst looking at IoT for the last 10 plus years, previously with Makina Research and now with Transformer Insights. So the challenging thing for me is kind of funneling this down, narrowing it down into what I think are some of the more interesting areas. So I'm probably leaving out things that will be absolutely fascinating and focusing on things that will be terrifyingly boring, but hopefully I've picked out some of the key things that you'll want to know about. A couple of words just quickly about Transformer Insights. So my previous company, Makina Research, focused exclusively on IoT. What we do at Transformer Insights is we cover IoT and a bunch of other disruptive technologies, AI, robotic process automation, product lifecycle management, a whole bunch of other things like that. And we do the usual set of best technical and commercial best practice, market forecasts, databases of case studies, and various other things that are grounded in real world examples, some actual evidence-based analysis of what's going on. And I mention that because I want to share a little bit about that, or a little bit of that, in the session today. So rather than just it being, here's a bunch of things that are in the book, I want to throw in a few other bits and bobs that we've come up with in our research as well. So, starting point for the book was this. It was that back in 2011, there was a lot of talk about how by 2020, there would be 50 billion connected devices. Now, that wasn't the only forecast that was around at the time. I know because I was forecasting this IoT market at the time, although we didn't call it IoT back then. And we were saying something like a quarter of that, 11, 12 billion connected devices. But this 50 billion figure really seemed to stick. It grabbed the zeitgeist, if that's a correct way of thinking about it. And that came from Ericsson, but Cisco was putting out more or less exactly the same sort of number, and there were a few other organizations talking about 50 billion connected devices by 2020. Now, obviously, the interesting thing is we're in 2020 now, and we haven't got 50 billion connected devices. And we thought, William and I, what better basis for writing a book than to look at, okay, well, why haven't we got to that 50 billion? What have been the biggest challenges and the biggest hurdles and the main reasons why we didn't get to that? Because the reality is this, okay, so what I've got here is just some numbers I've pulled out of our Transform Insights IoT forecasts. And we're looking at something like 8.5 billion devices by the end of the year. Would have been closer to 9, but for COVID, COVID's had a bit of a positive impact on increasing demand for various applications, more track and trace and a whole load of things in terms of factory automation and maybe onshoring, so you're not so dependent on supply chains, and other things in supply chain to overcome some of the challenges that we've seen. Okay, so increase in demand, but the supply side has been somewhat challenged. So you just can't get these things rolled out. Things like the UK smart meter rollout has been somewhat delayed, and there are a whole bunch of other things like that. So the impact short term was probably felt a little bit there. But the point is, we got to about 8.5 billion connected devices or we will do by the end of 2020. So bit less than 20% of some of the predictions that were out in the market, Ericsson and Cisco, etc. And the vast majority of these are home and office, so it's short-range connected devices. Not only is the quantity lower, but possibly you might argue the value is also lower because you're connecting them using private networks, short-range networks. Qualitatively, also, I'd argue that we're not quite there either, not quite at the level that we might have been promised back in 2011, 2012. Now, I love IoT, I'm an IoT guy, and during a lot of this session, I'm going to be a bit critical about things that have happened, but ultimately there's some fantastic impact. And I'm not telling you anything you don't know already when I say that there are a whole load of different use cases, from monitoring all the way through to new as-a-service type business models, where you can shift from selling a box to providing that box as a service. Now, the interesting thing is that back in 2010, 2011, what we're expecting was a whole lot more of these transformative business models, qualitatively rather different from the sort of monitoring, remote asset tracking type applications that had pretty much dominated until then, actually, and have dominated since. Now, this is a topic that I could talk about till the cows come home, but based on a lot of the extensive research that we've done, it's pretty obvious that it's a focus. The focus has been on the low-hanging fruit on that left-hand end of this slide, the more monitoring types of applications, environmental sensing, alarm, CCTV, that kind of thing, rather than the really exciting as a service based stuff at the other end. And something that's not in the book, actually, based on some other research that we've done, kind of illustrates this rather well. This is based on analysis of hundreds of real-world IoT deployments. And what we do is we look at a whole load of the characteristics of the deployment, the technical parameters, some of the commercial parameters around it, the geography, who the vendors are, these types of pieces of information, with a view to helping companies that are thinking about deploying those things to understand, what's best practice, what have other people done, which vendors have other people used. And when you look at it in aggregate, when you get to the hundreds of different applications, you can draw out some conclusions from it. And that's what we've done. This is just a small sample of it. I've got some links to to a couple of webinars at the end of the presentation, where you can go to check out where we've talked extensively about it. Much effectively hour-long webinars just about this topic. So if you're a glutton for punishment, then go there. But what I'm showing on this one is a couple of data points, a couple of sets of data points. The first one is plotting payback time against time to deploy. So you want an application ideally that's quick to deploy and quick to pay back. And that's what we've got in IoT today. We've got an average of 10 months to deploy and an average payback of 18 months, which is pretty short if you think about it, considering that more than 70% have a over 5-year lifespan, and 20% have more than a 10-year lifespan. Okay, so it seems pretty short term. And then if you look at the second piece of data on the right-hand side, which I'm showing, that's showing the impact of the IoT projects. Okay, so what we look at is, does it impact process efficiency, i.e. internal things? Does it impact the value proposition, i.e. your external product? Or does it disrupt the industry? I mean, it doesn't have to be one or either of those. It can be all three of them. But we look at each of the deployments in the context of those parameters. So we say, does it have limited impact? Is it moderate impact, significant, or transformational impact? And with IoT, we found that the vast majority, 70%-ish, had a significant or transformational impact on process efficiency. But when you go into the value proposition, it's more like 25%. And with industry disruption, it's barely 5%. So you have generally IoT applications only have an impact on process efficiency. So with that thought, or those three thoughts, we haven't reached the numbers. The technologies aren't quite as sophisticated as we might have thought. And thirdly, the implementations have largely been focused on those low-hanging fruit of some track and trace applications or internal process efficiency type applications. Let's dive in to the broad idea of maybe what's happening here. And I talk occasionally about the concept of an IoT winter. AI talks about winters a lot. They've had two so far, one in the 60s and one from the mid 70s to the mid 80s, if memory serves. And the idea behind the AI winter is that it's a period of slow, maybe consolidation, you could call it, after a period of relatively accelerated technological growth. Now, there's a lot of people who think that we're just on the cusp of the third AI winter. And it struck me that a lot of the ideas behind this concept of the AI winter also can be applied to IoT, to the point where it feels like 2015 onwards is something, perhaps a first IoT winter. Now, you go back far enough to the 90s, you had SCADA systems, and then that went into telematics and what we called M2M, which was gradual improvements over the years, mostly around custom build. And then in the 2010 to 2015 kind of time frame, we saw a bunch of really interesting technological developments which democratized, I guess is how you could describe it. The use of IoT made it much more accessible and easy to use, and more critically, perhaps cheaper. You had the platformization of the space. You had connectivity platforms like Jasper and Ericsson DCP pop up. You had application enablement platforms like ThingWorx or Plat One. And those things removed a lot of the development headaches that had existed in the prior time of developing in the sort of M2M world. There were a couple of other really interesting developments as well. Hardware costs fell almost to a freakish extent. I remember looking at this in the sort of 2011, 2012 time, when the average selling price was falling faster than the average, than the growth in shipments numbers, to the point where the value of the hardware market in IoT, the cellular hardware market actually, so amongst the likes of Gemalto and Sierra Wireless and Telit and so on, the value of the market was actually falling because the prices were coming down so rapidly. So hardware costs coming down. Also, connectivity costs were falling. And actually, they've continued to fall. I mean, we're talking about €10 for 10 years connectivity from companies like Once and similar sorts of things from a company called Blues Wireless in the States. So you're seeing tremendous cost declines there, and we also saw some really interesting new technologies. I mentioned NB-IoT earlier, but we had Sigfox and LoRa arrived ahead of them. So some tremendous new technologies and tremendous platforms, you could describe them as tools, might be a better term. They arrived. And then around 2015, things slowed down a bit. Specifically, the technology development slowed down a bit. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing. You can't keep going with your technology. It's a bit like deflationary economics, right? If you've got deflation, you don't buy a TV today because in 2 weeks it might be half the price, so you don't buy a TV. Similarly, if you're using it, you delay investing in a technology if you think there's going to be a new and better technology popping up in a year or two. So having a bit of a pause and a breather for a while actually is no bad thing. So perhaps winter is a bit of a pejorative term, but nevertheless, slowing of the technology development. Point is, I spoke at a conference a year or two ago, and they said, "Okay, what's happened in the last 5 years?" And really, I was racking my brains. It seems, though, that things are accelerating again. There are some really interesting technological and commercial models that are coming through that might be triggering an acceleration back out of this winter, but not perhaps around the technology areas that have driven it up until now. I think they become more established practice. And let's face it, there's not a lot lower in terms of price of connectivity that things can go, for instance. And the access technologies that we've got are perhaps sufficiently mature. Talk about that in a little bit. But we've got things like data exchanges coming through. There's also a lot more interest in edge computing and the role of the hyperscalers, the likes of Microsoft and Amazon Web Services. There's also network disaggregation, this separation of the hardware from the software layers of the network. So qualitatively different changes which could accelerate us out of this IoT winter. But back to the book. One of the things, in fact, a big focus of the book was, what have companies done wrong in terms of deploying IoT? What's really held them back? What's slowed things down? And there are a bunch, and I'll rattle through a few of these quite quickly now. The first one is obviously stupid product ideas. I mean, there were some absolute doozies in the sort of 2011, 2012 time. If you wandered around the show at the Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas, you'd have seen some absolute pearlers. Connected toothbrushes, smart kettles, things where you, by definition, have to be standing next to the thing anyway. So why would you want it connected? The $1,000 connected iron, connected rectal thermometers. I think perhaps the less said about that, the better. There's also the legendary connected fridge. Now, I will put in a kind word for the connected fridge. Actually, there is some value in the connected fridge, but mostly for the companies that make fridges, to understand how people are using them, and maybe even provide refrigeration as a service. But what there wasn't a market for was for people to pay for that, the additional bill of materials cost for connecting that fridge, or indeed to pay a subscription for their connected fridge. So that's delayed things somewhat, because the manufacturers of fridges need to find a business model that works for them to justify connecting the fridge. I think it will come, but I don't think it's based on charging an end customer. Implementation. Okay, so that's stupid ideas. Then you turn to implementation. The implementation is good ideas, but done badly. And a lot of these revolve around customer care. And actually one fundamental issue, which is around the conflict between the internet side of the house, which is about high fault tolerance and beta testing in field and so on, versus the things side of the house, which is about rigorous field testing and high compliance requirements and being slow to market. I mean, they probably don't consider being slow to market to be an asset, but nevertheless, it's certainly what happens. If you think about, for instance, Sonos and Philips just this year have got into some trouble by effectively applying the dynamics of the App Store to the real world environment for a device that you might have expected to last for 10, 15, 20 years in terms of lighting or music system, but turning them off, end of lifing these kinds of devices, which is not in keeping with what the average customer's experience is. So this idea that web scale dynamics apply in the physical world has hung around for rather longer than we might have hoped. In terms of the commercial, okay, so bad implementations and then bad commercial models or bad commercial thinking by the companies that are deploying. IoT is often deployed by the IT department, and they often don't give much consideration to how the organization works, or perhaps not sufficient consideration to how the organization works. And that can lead to what I've termed POC hell, where you get repeated proofs of concept, but you never actually deploy, because the company deploying hasn't really thought about the requirements for commercial and operational change alongside deploying new technologies. I'll talk about that in a little bit as well. But if we think about one example around this area is connected bins. Well, it's more associated with implementation actually, but the idea of connected bins. We all think that's a brilliant idea, right? You connect a bin, you can tell when it's full, then you can send a bin lorry to go and empty it. Fantastic, in theory. The reality is, though, that there is a set of infrastructure, lorries and people and refuse collection routes and so on, that it's rather more difficult than that to escape from, okay? In order to really take advantage of that refuse collection on demand, what you'd need is a network of independent contractors who have their own capabilities to go collect refuse as and when they see fit. So an Uber of bins. And I'm not convinced that that's an environment that we want to go to. So there's always been a challenge with getting organizations to understand the actual extent to which they can really make use of IoT. Lack of security. Now, security always rates very high as the big bugbear of and the big challenge when deploying IoT, and it's a systemic problem. And you think of things like the Jeep hack or the Ring Santa Claus hack or even the Mirai botnet. These create a lack of faith in security, which leads to slower adoption. Now, we have seen, very interestingly, in the last 12 months, some regulation around this area, which while the specifics are a little bit woolly in the US and the UK and the EU, Japan as well, while the specifics are a little bit woolly in some of them, the idea that you've got a framework, a set of rules that you might be able to comply with actually makes some sense. So I'm rather more hopeful about that now than I would have been a few years ago. But certainly in terms of getting us to 50 billion connected devices, that was another thing that held back market adoption. So stupid ideas, badly implemented. If you owned a garage door and you wrote a bad review about them and they gave you and they bricked your device, you probably would have not been overly excited about deploying more IoT. That commercial challenges, lack of security, all of these things added up to create some challenges with getting to the big numbers. Connectivity. I'm at heart a telecoms guy, and I like talking about connectivity, but actually I tend to find it's not the big challenge. Okay, there are, for most types of applications, one or two obvious technology choices that are standards based, and that generally helps quite a lot. If you can imagine the IoT connectivity on two dimensions, which is pretty much what I've presented here, one dimension being bandwidth, the other dimension being range, you can more or less divide the market up into four quadrants. And so broadband versus narrowband, and short range versus wide area. And on the in-building, the personal and the building area stuff, it's pretty much tied up. So it's Wi-Fi, it's Bluetooth, it's Zigbee in some contexts. On the broadband wide area, it's also similarly tied up. LTE now going to 5G eventually. It's the narrowband wide area, though, which I think was anticipated, well, I know was anticipated to account for a huge volume of those 50 billion connected devices, monitoring bridges and cows and just about any other kind of environmental feature you might care to mention. Well, the technology took a while longer than expected to bed in. But that's perhaps not surprising. The maturity issue is far from being a surprise because, let's face it, NB-IoT isn't even 5 years old. LoRa and Sigfox not much more than that. Now, there were a few missteps along the way, I think, with how some of these technologies were rolled out. But to a large extent, it's expectancy, the expectation that was the problem. Now, do we need to go to a single technology for it all to really take off? I'm a bit skeptical about that. I think there's room for two or three because they do fulfill slightly different functions. They have slightly different cost profiles, so there is space there. But we do tend to think that standards win in most cases. And we think, therefore, that NB-IoT will tend to dominate this market for this low power, wide area technology. But there is space for some other technologies, particularly LoRa in terms of private campus type networks. There's even room for that as an overlay because it makes sense from a price perspective. So there is space, but I think that part of the reason why things haven't accelerated quite as fast in the last 10 years is because it's taken a little while longer than some people might have thought for those technologies to bed in. Now, vendors do have quite a bit to answer for when it comes to why the market might not have taken off. I think if I had to use one word to characterize their approach to it, most companies' approach to it, that would be hubris. There was a lot of interest in IoT and a lot of expectation about being able to get in there and make a lot of money. But take GE, for instance. It thought it had a set of internal capabilities which it could take externally, and it would make a I was going to say make a million, but probably million is not exactly what it was targeting. So make a billion. But it didn't have the channels. It didn't have the correct organization. It kept reverting back to selling internally because that was what it was used to doing. Wasn't able to make the investments. There were some fundamental limitations for it to essentially change its spots from being a user of this technology to being a vendor of this technology. And that's just one example of where there's been challenges across this space, trying to get into other people's pieces of the value chain. And software is generally the perfect example. If you ask people who the success stories have been in IoT, they will point at companies like Jasper, which sold for $1.4 billion to Cisco, or ThingWorx, which was $112 million on about $5 or $10 million worth of revenue. You're talking about 20 or 30x revenue type valuations. Okay, so if you're a company in the IoT or adjacent to the IoT, you look at these companies, you think, wow, this would be brilliant. I need to pivot to be an IoT software company, and that will be the key to getting to scale and the higher valuation, right? Well, maybe, but there's a massive case here of survivorship bias. Okay, all you see, or all that these companies see, is the software companies that managed to command those valuations because they succeeded, but most don't. And it's only a small fraction that succeed. And so actually the chance of a pivot being successful is actually quite limited. And we saw this with particularly some of the hardware vendors. They thought, okay, well, what we need to be is a software player. We need to have a software platform. We need to be a connectivity player. And then we go from being a company that can command a valuation of 1 to 2x revenue to being a company that can command valuation of 30 to 40x revenue. But actually, the software that they developed or that they acquired was fine, but it wasn't tearing up any trees, and therefore didn't manage to command those kinds of valuations. They find themselves sitting exactly where they were before. So this passion for moving around in the value chain is a challenging thing. And the same goes for service provision, becoming a service provider. I'm a mobile network operator and I'm going to start selling fleet management solutions. Well, that's fine if you've actually got something that's able to differentiate your offering. Some do. Verizon, for instance, spent in the US, they spent about $3 billion on companies that provide fleet management to buy themselves into that sector. They couldn't just put up a sign and say, we do fleet management. In order to be taken seriously, they had to spend money. And that's proving to be the case for quite a lot of companies in that space. You need to find a way of actually being to actually differentiate an offering, or even have a realistic offering in the space. You take AT&T, for example. AT&T launched a security offering, a home security offering. Now, what means that they're any better than an ADT or an alarm.com? Nothing, virtually nothing. There is nothing to discriminate them. And eventually they closed it down and stopped selling it anymore, because there was just no way of differentiating it. So the lesson is, everybody started jumbling themselves up and getting involved in other people's parts of the value chain, confusing the hell out of anybody who was buying, because everybody would say, yes, we can do everything, right? So if the question was, okay, I want to buy all these different elements from an IoT solution, can you do it? The answer was always, yes, we can. But if you also ask the question, have you done this? The answer would often be, no, we haven't. And this, as I said, this confused the hell out of everybody. Now, does that mean you can't venture elsewhere in the value chain? No, of course not. But you need some kind of special differentiator to get into it. You either need to buy your way into it, or you need scale. Someone like an AWS probably can go into a particular part of the IoT space if it chooses to, because it can apply some type of scale to it. I think we've seen quite a lot more maturing and understanding of this from the standpoint of the vendors in the space. I think in particularly of communication service providers, I'm in the final throes of finishing off a report on benchmarking the CSP's capabilities in IoT. And one of the interesting things that come through now in this year compared to well, I first started doing it in 2012, so into previous years, is the extent to which they've kind of reined in their aspirations for going direct to customers, for having end service provision offerings, to say, okay, well, we're going to narrow it down to 3 or 4 verticals where, or maybe even 2 or 3 verticals, or in some cases, no verticals at all, because we're only going to go in where we think we've actually got a differentiator. And that's good news. But that certainly hasn't been the case for the last 10 years. A few recommendations for those IoT vendors. You can't just plunge in and make money. That's not how it works. You focus on your part of the value chain. It's hard to be good at doing someone else's job. In fact, most companies find it pretty hard to be good at their own job. So the idea of going off, wandering around in other parts of the value chain, it's only rarely been done successfully. I'd also say stop worrying about being the infinitely scalable platform and looking instead for gaps to fill and problems to solve. It's interesting that there's a company called Libelium, which some of you might have come across. They make predominantly IoT hardware devices. And they decided last year that they would diversify, but not diversify into software, but instead diversify into implementation, the implementation space. Now, that's a good space to be in. The margins aren't very good, and margins are fine. The scalability is not great because you need more people. And because the scalability is not great, the multiples for valuation of a company are not also that great. But there is a demand and there is a requirement to meet. So rather than just saying we're going to be a software platform as well, they identified what the gap in the market was and they went for it. There's also I think a good impetus to steer the clients in the right direction. I mentioned about getting too bogged down in proofs of concept earlier. I think it's incumbent on the vendors to do that as well. It's also incumbent to show you're in it for the long haul. I mentioned earlier about have you done this and can you do this, that sort of distinction. Well, companies are making a significant investment and a long-term investment in a particular technology platform, and often it's not technology companies that are doing this, and they will be very cautious. Caveat emptor, I will mention that in a bit, but caveat emptor will be the order of the day, and they need to be sure that organization is going to be in it for the long haul. I mean, someone like Google, for instance, has got a history of picking things up, playing around with them for a few years, and then dumping them. Right? That's not the kind of organization that buyers will select to get into bed with, because they're going to be in bed with them for a very long time. And security. I will rattle on about that till the day I die, I'm sure. But obviously, security as a starting point, or baking in developing secure solutions from the start is obviously a critical thing. Recommendations for IoT adopters. Now this is where it starts getting a little bit more interesting. A lot of people will tell you, and this is one of those aphorisms you will hear from time to time, they will say, think big, start small, move fast. Now, when I hear that, it sometimes triggers a bit of a rant for me, because I fundamentally don't agree. Okay, think big. Okay, fine, think big. That's there's nothing wrong with that. But actually, the challenge with all of this stuff is very rarely about the thinking. It's about the doing. Anybody can come up with a great idea. It's the actual implementation that's the challenge. Start small. Well, the problem with saying start small is, what are you actively choosing a project because it's small? If your house was on fire, would you start small by throwing a couple of pints of water onto it, or putting out the dog's kennel first? Of course you wouldn't. You would select your projects based on how important they were, how likely you were to be able to implement them, and the likely return on investment. So inevitably that in itself causes problems. If you're picking something just because it's small, I think you're missing the point. Now, it may well be that the quick return investments are small projects, but you should not be selecting them just because they are small. Moving fast, well, I mean, what's the alternative? Sometimes when I'm writing recommendations as an analyst, I think, okay, well, what would be the counter recommendation? And moving slow. Well, why would you deliberately move slow? I mean, you should move at the right pace for what it is that you want to do, surely, rather than moving fast. So that rant over. What I would recommend is be bold, but adopt a systems first approach. You generally won't find a competitive differentiator in incremental change. Now, the quickest ROI is often from the simplest deployment, but a true competitive differentiator will normally be rather more complex than that. But the key thing is to work out what your internal processes and systems are that you want to change and start from there. So systems first. Deployments need to be commercially led. You've got to make sure you're planning commercial and operational changes as well as the technological. I mentioned earlier it's common to focus on the technical, but that leads you down the road of POC hell, constantly doing technical POCs without any ability to then implement them in an operational or commercial capacity. This might be a bit contentious. Put someone other than IT in charge. Now, don't get me wrong, I love the IT department. The IT department is wonderful. But generally it needs to focus on the day-to-day running of the IT systems rather than the business transformation, which is implicit in IoT. So a CTO, for instance, would be a great thing to have within the organization. And
this is your time you won't worry.
Hello, I've got voices.
Sorry,
Finally,
we've got somebody that needs to unmute.
Finally, caveat emptor. I thought I was being heckled for a moment, but there you go. Caveat emptor. I mentioned this a while ago. Do your due diligence on the companies whose products you're planning to use, and select based on longevity and know-how. So it's not just can you, it's have you. Have you done this for other organizations? And finally, be prepared for change. Got another slide on that, which I won't go through in too much detail, but effectively, almost every aspect of an organization's operations will be affected by a really transformational adoption of IoT. So take that X as a service business model that I talked about earlier. For instance, a company I've spoken to in the past called Tomra, who make potato sorters. And they decided that rather than selling potato sorters, they would provide potato sorting as a service. It doesn't get more glamorous than that, I'm sure you'll all agree. The point is, though, that affected a whole load of areas within their organization. So their finances, for instance, suddenly their balance sheet needs to assume a whole lot more debt because they're not selling the hardware. They're giving the hardware to a company, so they have to find some way of financing that. Their business model obviously changes. The skills of the people internally need to change. So the salespeople are selling things in a completely different way. The operational processes all work in a completely different way. The systems and the processes inevitably need to change because you need to stitch data into your ERP, CRM systems, and so on. You need to invoice in a different way. And the culture of the company will probably need to change. It's probably the biggest one of all, is that culture needs to change from being a hardware company to being a services company. And there's one other, there's actually 8 areas of change, and the 8th one is change management. So you need a strategy for making the changes, having a consistent approach to how you make all of these necessary changes. Very quickly, a few future missteps. The idea that AI will save us. So the story runs a bit like this. There's going to be billions of connected devices. They'll generate loads of data. They'll feed into AI systems, and those insights will transform the world. But until we've got billions of devices and the data, there's nothing for the AI to train on. AI is very bad with new stuff. It's much better when it's had years and years worth of large data sets to deal with. So AI is not going to save IoT. It's an overlay that might be helpful in the future. And the idea that 5G will save us. Well, actually, really, 5G doesn't have that much to say to IoT. I mentioned it earlier. The low latency might well be useful for some niche roles, but generally speaking, I don't feel like 5G is a silver bullet. And I'm going to leave that one there and leave you with one final thought, which is I've been doing some work on this recently. It's a concept associated with a lot of technology areas that when you separate, and this is almost unrelated to IoT, but tangentially related to IoT, but just want to set you thinking. When you separate the hardware and the software layers of any given technology area, be it personal computing, or which we've seen since the 70s, 80s, or drones, or building management systems, or robotics, and telecommunications is an interesting one because that's happening now. If you separate those two layers, you start getting much more innovation because you free up organizations to innovate in each of those separately. And that results in an explosion of new products and services. And we saw that in personal computing, and we're starting to see that in some of the more sort of IoT focused spaces like drones and robotics and smart cities and energy. And we will continue to see that in future. This is a topic I've blogged about and also included in my podcast. So I would recommend you check out, I mentioned a couple of links. There's a couple of webinars which are focused on the findings from the case study analysis that I mentioned earlier. So there's a couple of links there. And also the podcast, my weekly podcast, we're on episode 5 now. And I explore all sorts of things related to IoT and AI and a bunch of other technology areas. That's the wireless needle. And that's it from me. Back to you.
That was brilliant. Thank you very much. I really appreciate you sharing your insight. If anybody's got any questions, please raise your hand or just make a noise. We have one from Adrian, our following speaker. Matt, do you have any insights on NB IoT versus LTE-M, Cat M1 as 2G replacements? I think he's leading into his talk quite nicely here.
Yeah, they fulfill slightly different functions. One being, well, LTE-M doesn't really have the battery life that NB-IoT does, and NB-IoT is much lower, much reduced capabilities. It's much more like 2G, and LTE-M is much more like, well, like LTE really. And so they will fulfill different parts of the market, which is fine. Geographically, they've tended to be adopted in slightly different ways as well. So NB-IoT, very big in China, less so in the US, where the focus has tended to be on LTE-M. But these are time issues, and the expectation is that pretty much all operators will have all of those technologies going forward. But we see NB-IoT as much more of a low power, wide area type technology than LTE-M is, which is more of a sort of a continuity piece with existing LTE. I'll leave that at that rather than rattling on much longer.
Does anybody else have any questions? If you're on mute, don't forget to take it off. But one of the things that I've found when I've been out there talking is, and a lot of what you just said really, really resonates, and I really appreciate it. But one of the things that sort of is resonating quite a lot, especially over the past 6 months when I've been talking to businesses, is actually they find the marketing and communication from technology companies, and in particular telecom companies, confusing them and making them feel stupid, because they talk in a very much technological way, when what they want to talk about is outcomes. They don't care how it's done. They want to understand how they can fix problems they have or create new services. Does that resonate with you? Are you coming across that as well?
It does. Obviously the challenge for anybody who's trying to sell this stuff in a should I say horizontal way is that they haven't got the speciality. They haven't got the expertise in. I mentioned the potato sorting company, right? So they bought their IoT solution off their ERP, their enterprise resource planning vendor, because that company understood how they worked, right? Yep. They knew the ins and outs of the organization. They knew what their data flows were. They could advise them, why don't you do this? Why don't you switch to working in a slightly different way? So they understood how they worked in a way that perhaps the telcos and other technology vendors may well not understand how they work, which often leads me to suspect that it's those ERP and CRM companies like Salesforce or SAP or Oracle who are likely to be able to better understand and talk the language of the companies that are wanting to deploy than, say, a telco. Yeah. Notwithstanding the fact that, mobile operators sell to every company in the world, but the conversation is a pretty two-dimensional conversation. Yeah. How many mobile phones do you want? How much data do you want? Bang, done. Right? It's not fundamental to how your business works in the same way that conversation might be with a Salesforce or particularly with an SAP or an Oracle. Right? They need to understand the nitty-gritty, and it's those companies who will really do well, and systems integrators and those types as well, because it's their job to get in there and understand really really get a hold of what the organization needs. So often the ones who are trying to sell more horizontally will struggle.
Yeah, and one of the things that sort of resonates with me a little bit as well is that there are a lot of companies out there that talk about that they're looking to sell to system integrators, for the system integrators to add 20% of the solution and take it in there. I'm yet to find that system integrator. I work in edge computing, in particular machine vision, utilizing edge. It's such quite a niche thing. Computer vision's been there for a while, edge computing's been there for a while, and bringing them together and then building into everything else it's a little bit different, should we say, but it is really true IoT. It really is connecting everything, and as you said, it's sort of system led. It's about connecting the systems and then adding new technology to it. But the companies that are out there that actually have the experience to implement are very few and far between, which makes it that challenge of actually getting the sell to, so to speak.
It is, and they're few and far between for a good reason, because there's not a lot of people buying this that kind of stuff, right? That's the fundamental issue, and it will tend to be the big guys who will be doing the interesting stuff, and so it's a question of getting on the radar of your T-Systems and Accentures and so forth, because they're likely to be the ones who are doing this stuff, and then you're going to ask me how you do that, and the answer is, well, it ain't easy. There are, talk to as many people as you can.
Yeah, one of the approaches that we're doing, we're fortunate. One of the things resonated really well again off one of your slides is we're a hardware company that bought a software company, and we're bringing the two together. So there's more of that solution rather than just selling the hardware. We're adding additional value with the software, which has really, helped us accelerate our success. And one of the things that we recognized was actually there's a huge skill set shortage in the technology that we're offering. So what we're doing is making that easier to adopt. So you could do less code, more configuration to focus on the stuff like machine learning and developing dev kits, such as VisiAI, my product. Is a dev kit to enable you to utilize the edge computing, the vision side of things, and then creating very quick outcomes leveraging cool tools like Node-RED, which you could move into production if you wanted to, or you can replace that with another app quite easily. Enough about me. Matthew Roberts. Matt, you highlight that much of the IoT success has been with presenting cost savings. Do you see anyone coming in with a value proposition?
How do you mean?
That's a good question. Matthew, do you want to elaborate a little bit?
Yeah, sorry. It was more just I kind of shortened what I was asking. Basically, at the moment, everyone sells IoT on the basis, or it seems to me that everyone sells IoT on the basis of saving a company money. So you take an existing process and we can make it more efficient. We can make it more. We can make it kind of report back to you more, and so therefore, or more intelligently, and so therefore, save you money.
Changing existing internal processes effectively.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Do you see anyone kind of coming in with anything that is more visionary, I guess, really, and or more transformational? And it's not so much this is going to save you money, this is going to make you money as a business.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there are, but it tends to be sector by sector. Okay, so you think about the car industry. Well, there are options for adding additional products and services onto vehicles to sell more services and make money as a result. But in most cases, it is the internal efficiency saving that's been the dominant one. I mean, in terms of transformational stuff, the idea of the X as a service one, I mean, that's new business models. It's new revenue streams. It's alternative options. So that kind of plays to what you're talking about, and we have seen that from quite a few people. Companies like Relayer and struggling to think of others at the moment off the top of my head who kind of take that, who encourage somebody to move into that space by providing them with a set of tools to not just have the technical piece, but also the commercial models associated with being a service company rather than a products company. A lot of the consultancies will I'm sure do that as well if you've got deep pockets.
I've got an example. So the company that I work for, Matthew, AD Link, we created a smart pallet solution, which isn't pallets being tracked with beacons. It's actually using cameras above it with edge computing. It pulls the inventory from the ERP systems, distributes it across the cameras, and when you hold under it the box, instead of scanning it with a gun, then scanning the pallet, you hold the box underneath it. The camera recognizes it's a box, it recognizes a label, and it reads the barcode, not rocket science. It then flashes red or green, and it tells you if it's on the right pallet or the wrong pallet. If it's wrong, it flashes red. It'll flash green on the correct pallet. You put the box on. Creates a major amount of efficiency, full track and trace of the boxes. It stopped a company losing hundreds of thousands of dollars because boxes were put on the wrong pallet on purpose. So when they were left over at the end of a shift in a van, they were sold online. This then is an initial project for one customer. We took to another customer and they really liked it, which was a meat distribution company in the US. So they took this solution and then they recognized that actually because of this efficiency, they could start to create tailored pallets for smaller businesses. So they had historically always provided meat to big companies like Walmart. They were looking to expand their business and grow, but they needed a way to be as efficient, if not better, to be able to distribute to John's Butchers down the road. With this technology and the smart pallet side of things and utilizing the cameras across their whole distribution, they could actually rotate the stock as well very easily because they knew where everything was at all times. They were then able to then create a new business model and go into a new market they'd never been able to do before, utilizing the connectivity with the systems and leveraging the camera technology and the edge computing. So when the edge computing was, all the data was published and subscribed, flying around the network constantly. So everything they knew where everything was in real time. So it created amazing efficiencies. That same technology we've evolved for another customer where they're looking inside the box now. So Girl Guides cookies, you use the same technology, but it recognizes the tailored box filling. So, you know, if you wanted 3 chocolate chip, 2 apple, 2 blueberry, it recognizes from the color of the boxes which they are. It checks it against the inventory. If it's correct, it flashes green. If it's wrong, it flashes red. They used to have, I believe it was something crazy like a 60% mistake and having to send out the correct boxes that were missing. And very rarely got the ones back that were sent in incorrect. They got that efficiency to 99.5%. So then what they're now doing is now expanding their service based on that they're now offering a more tailored distribution service for other customers because they've got the efficiencies right. They can now expand their business on this as well.
Interesting. Very good.
Okay. Any other questions? Matt, thanks so much for your talk. I've really enjoyed it, and look forward to sharing it online. Thanks very much, Matt.